Hate speech. Let's talk about it. Today on the Half of This Show.
Is this camera on me?
Alright, so this week on the Half of This Show, this is the final episode of our First Amendment Privilege series. First episode, we covered free speech versus expressive conduct. The second episode, we covered unprotected speech, what that means and why it's important. And all of these things are important when we are leading into the topic and discussion of hate speech. So, in this episode, we're going to break down just exactly what hate speech is, why it's allowed in our country, how we can restrict it, and maybe some future implications of what hate speech will look like in the future. So let's get into it. I'll go ahead and say outright up front, there is no universal definition for hate speech in America. It is a very slippery slope when considering what is considered hateful speech. When we think of hate speech, we often consider racial slurs, but this also includes speech targeted at sexual identity, gender orientation, classism, racism, anything targeted at a specific group of people with the intent to be detrimental, even without the intent. If it's said or done and it is targeting a group of people, it could be considered hate speech. So what's important to understand about hate speech? When you're thinking about hate speech, it is important to understand that the Constitution protects just any and all ideas, long as they are not provoking violence, directly producing violence, or some other illegal action. Words by their very essence themselves are not illegal, and the free speech protects that under what is known as the marketplace of ideas. So just what is the marketplace of ideas? The idea with the marketplace of ideas, the idea with the marketplace of ideas. I don't like that. Let's rephrase that. So the thing to remember with the marketplace of ideas is that any and all thoughts are welcome in the marketplace. If you think of it like back in the day where they had open markets where they would go bring goods and sell whatever they had at the market and people will go and buy it. The idea here is that the same thing comes with your thoughts, words, and expressions. You can bring whatever you want in America. You can say whatever you want. And eventually, the good products, the good thoughts, the good ideas, the good expressions weed out all the negative ones. And all that's left is the popular and more appropriate concepts in society. What is viewed as acceptable in society is what ultimately beats out the bad thoughts. So by allowing hate speech, you're allowing other forms of speech as well. If we were to limit hate speech, we would be having to limit a lot of other categories of speech as well. And what might have been deemed unacceptable in 1920, 1850, might not be deemed unacceptable now. Take communism, for example.
I beg your pardon?
Back then, if you were considered a communist, you were going to jail. Like, they are actively pursuing anybody who aligned themselves with the Communist Party. Nowadays, there's a whole movement for people who align themselves with communism and would like to see it come about in America. And the marketplace of ideas allows that now. So, should hate speech be unprotected speech? The answer is yes. I think so. That there is no room within the United States for hateful targeted biased speech. But it is virtually impossible to define.
What? Nobody here's Jewish, right?
Gee, I don't know. Are you Jewish, Gordon?
Gee, I don't know, Jeremy. Are you?
God, I had no idea. I'm sorry.
Hey, Brian, we're both Italian. You're in.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
Italians are not just
Holistically, what is deemed unacceptable as hate speech? So, when you're considering many forms of comedy or art, a lot of those things are based off of stereotypes. Now, are those satirical jokes and all those sarcastic remarks and humor and those comedic skits, are those hateful speech? No, it's done with an air of sarcasm and satire. But if we put hate speech put it in its own bucket of unprotected speech, we would have to restrict even comedy and satire. And that simple definition there is the reason why hate speech is allowed and why it's not considered unprotected speech. It's too much intersectionality between things that are considered okay to say in America. Cambridge Dictionary defines hate speech as public speech that expresses hate or encourages violence towards a person or a group of people based on their race, religion, sex, or sexual orientation. The thing here with hate speech, though, is even though we allow all ideas to come about, there is a limit to just how much you can say. And that's where we have that idea back in episode 1 of this series with content-based and content-neutral restrictions. The government can restrict what you say, but they have to meet certain thresholds of scrutiny. So I'm only going to talk about 2 today. The first one is intermediate scrutiny. So with intermediate scrutiny, the government needs to have an important government interest, and the restriction need be no greater than necessary. And the last thing to remember with intermediate scrutiny is that the restriction has to be unrelated to the suppression of free speech. So let's break that down. Having an important government interest means that it is loosely relevant to something the government holds valuable. It's not the top priority, but it's somewhere in the middle, somewhere that they can finesse a restriction from an interest, such as like some city or municipality ordinance where they don't want you protesting in the middle of the street because it disrupts traffic or something like that. That would be an example of a important government interest. And the restriction itself isn't related to suppressing what you're saying. The restriction is there to uphold traffic and control, stuff like that. BS. So an example of the restriction being no greater than need be. This simply means that you can accomplish what you're trying to do with your government interests in the easiest, less restrictive fashion. So if I want to keep traffic controlled between the hours of 9 and 3 p.m. by preventing protesters from being on the street during those times, that would be the least restrictive method of controlling that or producing that result. The next level of scrutiny is actually the highest level, and this one is strict scrutiny. You see strict scrutiny when the government is trying to restrict your political speech. You see, and now these levels of scrutiny don't only apply to free speech. You see them when you're processing other facets of government as well. So for strict scrutiny, you need to have a compelling government interest, and it needs to be narrowly tailored. So just what does it mean to be narrowly tailored? Similar to intermediate scrutiny, where there was no other restriction that was, like, the restriction is no more controlling than need be. With a strict scrutiny, with a compelling government interest, it needs to be narrowly tailored. So that means there are no other ways of restricting what you're trying to produce. So the landmark case to remember with hate speech comes from RAV versus St. Paul, which came about in, I believe, 1992. So it's a relatively recent case. In RAV versus St. Paul, several teenagers burned a cross on a black family's yard. The police charged one of the teens under a local bias-motivated criminal ordinance in Minnesota, which prohibits the display of a symbol which arouses anger, alarm, or resentment. So the question here is the ordinance too broad? Is it violating those teenagers' First Amendment rights? Supreme Court decided that in a 9-0 decision, so they all agreed that this was overly restrictive. So in a 9-0 decision, the Supreme Court decided that this violated their First Amendment rights. The government should not restrict speech or expressions that are otherwise permitted simply because they disapprove of the content of that speech. So that goes back to the content-based restriction. They can't restrict what you're saying simply because they don't agree with what you're saying. Now you see why that is important in America? If the government restricted everything they did not like or everything they disagreed, can you imagine if every time the president got on Twitter and saw a tweet that he didn't like, he sent out a warrant for somebody's arrest to go and arrest that person? There'd be a lot of people in jail. The First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States protects us from that type of restriction. And that is exactly why hate speech exists in America. So just what did we go over today? Today we covered what hate speech was, why it is unacceptable, why it exists. We also covered the marketplace of ideas and levels of scrutiny. This concludes our series on the First Amendment. As always, this has been the Half a Day Show, once again, bringing you education, entertainment, and everything in between. See y'all next week.
Thank you.